this morning. Always enjoy coming this way. It's kind of like a mini vacation for us to be able to get away for the weekend. We're just always thankful for it. Before we get into the sermon this morning, does anyone have a prayer request or anything on their heart? Would ask that y'all would remember, I guess he's my age at Fairview, Brother Trevor Henderson. He announced that he was called to preach last Sunday, so he's going to be preaching his first sermon this coming Wednesday night, so remember him. I know he's very stressed out and nervous about it, so just remember him. He wasn't raised in our way, so just remember him this week.
Amen.
But we're thankful for that. Now we have, counting me, 5 preachers at Fairview under 26, so remember us and as we try to go our way doing what the Lord calls us to do. But if nobody has anything this morning, we're going to be reading out of 1 Samuel chapter 17, all over what the Sunday school lesson was this morning. I was like, Brother Ernie, you need to tone it back a little bit. You're getting on my sermon, but... So, of course, we know that's the story of David and Goliath. But before we get there, the thought that we have for this morning is don't despise thy youth. That comes from 1 Timothy, and we'll be in over there this morning too. But the thought we have is don't despise thy youth. But we know for all of history, there's always been a tendency for just humans in general to dismiss the younger ones in the church and the world, whatever it may be. The older generations always look and say, well, those younger ones, they don't know what they're doing. They don't have the skill. They don't have the know-how. They haven't done it. I've done it. They can't do it. And that's often how we get in our churches. We look at the younger ones and they say, well, they can't do it because they haven't been there before. They haven't been in that situation. And that's what they did to David. They told David he couldn't do it. And then he went and showed them wrong. And that's what we want to look at this morning. But we always say how blessed we are to have young ones in the church. And, it is a great blessing to have those young ones in the church, but do we do anything to really help them? Do we just say, okay, it's great, we have kids, we have teenagers, we have young adults, or do we actually try to help them to learn? We study with them, teach them lessons, give them wisdom, or do we just kind of go through the motions and, okay, they're here on Sunday, we're good to go? Or do we really do we really try to teach them so that they can do something, that we don't despise that youth, that we try to build them up and that we try to embrace that youth? But oftentimes I feel like we just go on and we just worry about ourselves. We don't worry about anyone else. And we just want to get through the 2-3 hours that we're here on Sunday morning and just get on our way. And that's not how we need to be, of course. Or, the younger ones, they may have an idea of something that they like to do. They have something they want to do for the youth weekend. They have a suggestion. Do we listen to it or do we just brush it under the rug? We have to respect our youth because they're saved members of the church just like you are. There's no difference. One doesn't hold a higher ranking than the other. But, this morning we're going to look at David and how, people despise his youth. But look what he did in order to help the Israelite nation to grow and to achieve what they were trying to do that day. And that leads us to our reading that we have this morning, coming from that 1 Samuel chapter 17. We'll read verses starting in verse 28. But just a little background before we get there, because we all know the story of David and Goliath. We were taught it when we were in our youngest Sunday school class. We can remember hearing that story. But just a little background on it before we get to where we were reading this morning. So, David was the youngest of his brothers. And when you look at the way Jesse translated, said that he was the youngest of his sons, if you look at that word in Hebrew, it means like the most unimportant of his sons. His father didn't really think that he was that important. He just was like, yeah, that's the run of my boys. He's over here not paying them any attention. And it calls David the runt of all of his brothers. So no one really cared about him. I'm sure he was loved and cared for, but they held his brothers to a higher standard and looked out for what they did more. And then we know that where we're going to start reading this morning, Goliath came out and he was taunting the Israelites. He was saying, your God can't do this, your God can't do that. No one's going to come out and fight me. Y'all are all scared of me. He was 9 foot tall. There was reason to be scared of him. Just for reference, in most of our houses, we have, 7-8 foot ceilings? So he couldn't fit in most of our ceilings, most of our homes, because he's taller than the ceilings. So it was good reason for people to be scared. You know, they let their flesh take control when they should have been not using their eyes, but should have been using faith. You know, walking out with the Lord, holding on, knowing that the Lord was going to be with them. So, you know, David comes up. His father, he was out with his sheep. He was protecting the flock, watching over the flock, being a shepherd. And his father said, hey, come here, boy, take this food, take it up to your brothers that are in battle. You know, give them something to eat. They've been there for a while. I want to say 40 days for some reason, but I can't remember for sure. And so that's what David did. And that's where we pick up with our reading this morning. But just for reference, you know, David was, from what we have been able to, you know, it doesn't say how old he was in the scripture, but just putting together, he was about 13 to 15 years old. You know, so he wasn't very old. I mean, he obviously was not completely grown yet. He was small. That's probably why they called him the brunt, because his brothers were, you know, they were men. They were grown, and they were probably of big stature. You know, they were warriors. They were fighters. They probably were strong in what you would think about when you think about a warrior. That's probably what his brothers were. And then here comes David up with his groceries. You know, just a little, say, 14-year-old boy just carrying his groceries up to this battle. And then, you know, he opens his mouth. But, you know, so, you know, his family didn't really think very much of him. They said, you know, just go be a shepherd. You don't have much to do out there. Just go watch these sheep. Just make sure nothing gets to them. So, I mean, when we started reading, it says that David's brother was mad that David was even at the battle. You know, he walked up to his brother and goes, what are you even doing here? You have no right to be here. You're just here, you know, I don't know if y'all use this term here, but in Kentucky you say, you know, you're just here rubbernecking. You know, you go by a wreck and you see everybody doing like that. They're rubbernecking, wanting to see what went on. That's what his brother thought he was doing here. That he just thought David was there rubbernecking. Didn't think he had no business being there. And Saul told David that he couldn't fight. And David wouldn't take no for an answer. You know, how often do we know we're supposed to do something and someone tells us no, so we just go with that? You know, David didn't take no for an answer because he knew that the Lord was going to be with him. He knew that the Lord was going to help him. But, you know, in our reading that we're going to get to, David tells Saul all of the things that he's done to protect the flock. You know, all the different animals he had to kill, the animals he had to fight to be able to protect that flock. And then Saul finally gave in, and that's when David gets ready and and starts to walk down and go fight Saul. And that's finally where we pick up this morning. And we're going to start there in verse, 28 and read through verse 37. 1 Samuel chapter 17. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why comest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left the few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thy heart, for thou art come down with the mightiest to see the battle. I mean, his brother was like, what are you doing here? You need to be off protecting our sheep. Who's protecting the sheep that we have? And you're up here just, you know, being rubbernecking, wanting to see this battle. You want to see who's going to go and fight. You want to see if it's going to be one of your brothers or what big man is going to go fight this 9-foot giant that's down of the Philistines. And David said, what have I now done? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him towards another, and spake at the same manner, and the people answered him again after the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, thou art not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defiled the armies of the living God. David said, moreover, the Lord that had delivered me out of the paw of the lion, and out of the paw of the bear, will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with thee. Nobody thought that David could go and that he could defeat Goliath. And we know, we're a little bit farther, and we can see that he goes and he defeats Goliath. No issue. And the Lord was right there with him. But everybody said, you're too young. You can't do this. You're not a man of war. You're just a youth. They despised his youth and said, you can't go do that. You can't fight this giant. You don't know what you're doing. If we read a little bit farther, Saul tried to give David all of his armor. And David wouldn't take it. But the picture I have in my head, when they selected Saul for king, they wanted a man that looked like a king. Someone that looked like a leader. Someone that was probably, muscular, very defined, and had defined features. And that's who they picked as their king. So, you have like a 13, 14-year-old boy walking around with the armor from a king. Someone who was adult. It'd be like trying to put my clothes on Oakley is what I picture. Oversized for David. And David said, no, I'm not wearing this. That's not for me. So what did David do? He went down in the valley, down in the brook, and he got him 5 smooth stones and said, I know the Lord's got me. And that's all he took to that battle, was his slingshot and those 5 stones. He had faith in the Lord that the Lord was going to be right there with him when all these men aboard, all these men who were trained, who had fought many battles, didn't have the faith to be able to go out and stand up against this giant. No, you have to think, we know how long it takes for a rock to erode. It takes years and years and years for a rock to finally erode and be smooth. It doesn't just happen overnight. The Lord put those 5 smooth stones right there and had them there, prepared them for David. He knew David was going to come and that he was going to need those 5 smooth stones. He was preparing that before, David was probably ever born. He knew how that was going to work. And that's always just amazes me how the Lord always has everything right in order the way it needs to be for His plan and His will to work. In the same with David. You're out in protecting the flock. You're just out there. You just got to watch the sheep, make sure nothing comes. Now, we think that's got to be boring. I'm sure he had his slingshot when he was out there watching the flock and that he was practicing. That's how he passed his time. He wasn't prepared for anything. He was just trying to pass time so that he could watch his flock and not fall asleep. But the Lord was preparing David for that, so he had practice with that. And then he had the skills to be able to use that slingshot so that the Lord had prepared him to have those skills so that he could defeat Goliath. And while I was reading and studying for this, something came to my attention I had never really thought of before. But it says that when David flung that stone, it hit Goliath in the forehead. But Goliath fell face down. Physics doesn't work that way. If you get hit in the forehead, you're going to fall back. That right there tells you that the Lord took care of all of it. David just had to have the faith to go out there and do it. Because it says the stone sunk into his forehead and he fell forward. The Lord was right there with him on that. So that leads us, so what? What does this have anything to do with us? It's just a story you've heard all of my life. It's just David and Goliath. Everybody knows what it is. So what does this old story, this old story have to do with us? There's nothing new under the sun. Everything that David faced is the same things that we're facing today. It may not be the exact same way, but it's the same tendencies. We have the same tendencies in that we do now. Nothing changes. The same thing there. They didn't trust David to be able to go out and do this. They just looked with their eyes. They didn't look with their heart. They didn't look with the faith. They didn't look with what they needed to. They were just looking at with their fleshly eyes and saying, you can't do that. You're half his size. You're the runt of your brothers, and you're going to go fight this 9-foot giant? That's not how it works, and that's how we always think. We always look with our eyes instead of looking with our hearts. But David was the youngest. He was the least cared for. He was the runt. But God had great plans for David. Now, God already knew that David was going to be king. That he was going to have to run and hide from Saul and knew exactly everything David was going to do. But he still made him small. Now, small stature. Didn't make him anything to look at, but God had great plans for him. I think he did that just to prove people like, hey, it doesn't take someone who has the stature. It doesn't always come with what you visualize in your head isn't always going to be what you see. It's going to be what I want, and that's the way it's going to work. But we can see that God used David after a leap of faith on David's part. David didn't just sit down and, get his popcorn out and wait for someone to go down there and fight Goliath. He said, I will go fight him. He had that faith. And how often do we need to have that faith, but we never do it? we never exercise our faith. We just sit down, sit on our hands and say, I'll do that next time. It's not my time right now. And that's not how we need to be. Think what would have happened if David done that. If he would have just sat back and said, nope, I'm not going to do this. That's a giant. Where would they be? But instead, he defeated Goliath. And then all the Philistines, they ran. And the Israelites ran after them and was defeating them while they were running. They chased them through a couple of towns, I believe it says, if you read a little longer. But what would have happened? Would the Philistines have taken over the Israelites then if David wouldn't have acted? We don't know. But because of David's faith, we don't have to know the answer to that question. But they despise his youth. And I would say all of us can relate to David at some point in our lives. When we were younger, we always wanted to do something, but they said we couldn't do it because we were too young. You can't do this because you're too young. You can't do that because you're too young. And then you finally get up to the age to do it, and you're like, well, that's no big deal. Whatever. That wasn't what I was expecting. It's like whenever, I guess here's when you turn 15, you get to drive. But in Kentucky, when you turn 16, you get to drive. That's all we look forward to, turning 16 to finally get to drive. Now that I've been driving, I'm like, well, it's not that big of a deal. Whatever it is. Sometimes you're like, I'm tired of driving. I just want to stay home. But when you turn 16, that's all you want to do. And then, at home, when you're 14, by law, you're too young to drive. But then when you get to 16, you can drive. That's all you look forward to because they despise that youth. They don't think you're capable to drive at 14. But you're really not capable to drive at 16 either. So I don't know what the difference is. But whatever it may be, we always despise youth. We think that the youth cannot do anything. But it makes me think back to when I was first called to preach. I was 16 years old and I was told I was called to preach, and everybody just kind of looked at me and was like, okay, you'll preach a few sermons. I was able to go around, preach a few sermons, and nobody was like, okay, he's too young. He can't really do anything just because, he's 16, he's 17 years old. He doesn't know what he's doing. But that's when the Lord called me. So the Lord had plans for me. And I've heard people being called at 11 years old. Nobody trusted him, but that's the plan that the Lord had for that one. And we just have to trust in the Lord's plan. When God tells us to do something, we have to act. It doesn't matter how old we are, but we have to act. It doesn't matter if we're the youngest member of the church or the oldest member of the church. We have to act. Age doesn't matter. When we follow the Lord, we're setting an example for everybody else in our church family by saying, leading by example. You can tell someone how to lead all you want, but the best way that you can set an example is by your actions. That's what people watch. They don't watch, what you tell them to do. They watch what you actually do and how you live your life. But, just like with David, he set that example. He was willing to go out and step on that faith and go down and fight Goliath, and then the whole army followed once Goliath was down. Whole army followed. Can you imagine all these men, they were too scared to go down and fight them. Then you got that little 14-year-old boy coming up holding Goliath's head like this, like, look what I did. I followed the Lord. I took a step out on faith. And that's what we have to be willing to do. But oftentimes we're like, that's not for me. I don't want to do that. That's not my job. There's that meme going around saying that's not my job. That's how we look at stuff. We think, well, I'm not a preacher, so I don't have to go and do that. No, it's like what we said in Sunday school this morning. You can change that one letter to teach. We're all supposed to teach. We're all supposed to spread the gospel, just like the woman at the well. The age doesn't matter. And then that leads us over to 1 Timothy. We're going to read 1 Timothy chapter 4. But a little background on Timothy, because, we can read all of this. We can read about David and Goliath. We can read about Timothy. We can read about the Israelites. But if we don't know the history around them, it makes it harder for us to understand because it's just kind of words on the page. But when we see that history around it, it helps us to understand what's going on, So we looked at the Old Testament and looked at what David did. And at his young age, he was a teenager. Now we don't think teenagers are capable of doing anything but going to school. But now we're going to read about Timothy and what Paul said to him. Because we know that, the letters, 1 and 2 Timothy, are written by Paul to Timothy, who was a young preacher, young pastor. So Timothy was born in the Asia Minor, and his mother was Jewish, who had become a Christian. She was saved. And his father was Greek. He's a Gentile. So, his faith, what he learned about the Lord and whatnot, came from his mother and his grandmother. It tells us that in 1 Timothy. And Timothy met Paul during one of his missionary journeys. Paul was coming around on his journey, and that's whenever they met. And the New Testament tells us that Timothy traveled with Paul, and Paul was his mentor. So whenever they first met, Timothy was probably, teenagers, 17, 18, 20. That's what they say, the scholars believe, that how Timothy was. When he first met with Paul and started traveling with him and learning from him. But whenever Paul was writing to Timothy, he was probably about 30 years old. So he was twice the age that David was, but he was still considered youth during this time. And that leads us to where we're at for our reading for this morning. That 1 Timothy chapter 4, we'll do verses 9 through 14. It says, "This is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptation. For therefore we both labor and suffer reproach, because we trust in the living God, who is the Savior of all men, specifically of those that believe. These things command and teach. Let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers in the world, in conversation, in charity or love, in spirit, in faith, in purity. Till I come, give accountance to reading, to expectation and doctrine. Neglect not the gift that is in thee," talking about salvation, "which was given thee by prophecy with the laying on the hands of the presbytery." That's just talking about when he was ordained. But right here, Paul's encouraging Timothy. Timothy was the first pastor of the church at Ephesus. Brand new church, trying to teach people literally from the ground up. People that, at this time, Christianity was still a new thing altogether. Jesus hadn't been gone that long. Excuse me. So Timothy was trying to bring up a new church. He probably was just, didn't really know what he was doing, just going all on faith. But judging by the context clues that we have in this reading, nobody really thought Timothy was old enough to pastor. They probably all thought he was too young. He was 30 years old. They thought he was too young to pastor, and they thought they needed an older, wiser man to teach them. They pictured somebody like Paul. They were expecting someone, older age of Paul to come and to teach them and to show them what they needed to know. And don't we do that same thing today? When you think about a pastor, you think of somebody, older, gray hair, whatever the case may be. And you think about, older man that is wise. And that's what they were thinking about at Ephesus. They were expecting someone older, not Timothy, not someone 30, not somebody younger. That's not what they were expecting. And how often do we let age play a factor in everything that we do? You may say, well, this person can't pastor because, they're too young. This person can't pastor because they're too old. They're just not in the health to be able to do it. But, it doesn't matter who it is as long as it's who the Lord wants there. The age doesn't matter. And we'll get to a little bit more of that later. But, that goes into any office, not just the pastor of the church. The age doesn't matter. No matter what's going on, it doesn't matter. As long as the Lord's leading it, that's all that matters. The age doesn't play a part in any of it. But just as with David, God had a plan for Timothy. And Timothy went on, and he was the pastor of that church. And I'm sure many souls were saved because of the preaching and his teaching and what he did for that church. But Paul told Timothy, don't let anyone despise your youth. And, often that's what we hear. We don't hear the second part of that verse, and we're going to get to that a little later. But he told Timothy, don't let anybody think anything of you. Yeah, you're younger, but don't let anybody think anything of it because you're exactly where the Lord wants you to be. That age that you have is just a number. But we're going to look at it at the two different age groups this morning. We're going to have, we're going to talk to the youth and we're going to talk to the older ones. And that's the two parts of that verses. But we're going to go to the older ones first, and I'm not trying to call anybody out. It's just what the Lord laid on my heart and the way to do this morning. But, as we said earlier, oftentimes the older ones don't want to put any trust into the younger ones. They want to do everything themselves. Just the way we are. The longer that you're alive, the harder your heart's going to get to this world, and it just, it makes us more stubborn. It makes us think that we can do it all and that we don't need anybody to help us. We have a way that we do things, and we don't want anybody else coming in and showing us how to do it. Now, that's just human nature. And that's how, people are with the church. Just for instance, just with our normal household chores. You know, you have a set way that you want to do things and you don't want anybody to help you. Then you're going to ask for somebody to help you and you're going to get mad because they didn't do it your way. And we can't be like that. We can't be like that in the church. When we ask for help, we have to be open to those fresh and new ideas, as long as it's not changing our doctrine and changing the way of salvation. But, you know, Paul told Timothy, don't let anybody despise your youth. Meaning, don't let the older ones think that you can't do it. You just put your head down and you continue to work and you prove them wrong. Don't give them any reason to think that you can't do it. Don't let, you know, them see any little fault that they could dig in and say, you're too young to do this. Don't let them see that. But but almost every plan God has is we don't understand. You know, God sees everything as a whole, and we just see a little snapshot. I like to see it as, you know, as if you're sitting and watching a parade, if you can only see a certain part of that parade. You know, you can only just see from between this building and this building. But God can see the whole parade all at one time. You know, we have to watch the parade as it goes by slowly. We can't see it all until we can look back and think about it in our memory. But God sees it all at one time. He knows exactly what's coming. He knows exactly what's next. And we just have to sit and wait to see what's next. He'll show us what's next in His time. Because, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, time doesn't really matter. The Lord invented time for us. He invented day and night for us to be able to distinguish days and distinguish what we do. But the Lord doesn't need time. He just made it for us. He doesn't care about age. He doesn't care about any of that. He just cares about being obedient, like what we talked about this morning. It's all the Lord really asks for, is just for us to be obedient and to do what He would have us to do. But back, you know, to the older. But, you know, Jesus even told us that we need to come to the Father as children. You know, we need to come with that humble heart. We need to come as low as children. I know with my kids, when they need something, you know, they come up to me, Daddy, I need help with this. They don't come up to me and say, hey, I need you to do this now. You know, they come up and they ask. They're nice about it because they want it and they know that they can't get it on their own. Is that how we approach the Lord, or do we go up to Him and go, here's my laundry list, this is what I want done, and this is how you're going to do it? I know that's how I approach the Lord most of the time. I don't ask, you know, prayer shouldn't be us giving our laundry list and telling the Lord what our will is. It should be us asking what His will is. And, you know, we should be doing a lot more listening than we should be talking. But, you know, just the way the human body works, you know, the older generation, they don't seem to always have the want to get out and do all of these extra activities. You know, their bodies just can't let them do it. They get tired. They get fatigued. Well, the younger ones, you know, they have the want to. They have the push. They have the desire to get out there and to work. Just think if we put those two together, you know, how great our church could be. But, you know, the older ones, they have to believe in the younger ones. You can't just say, no, you can't do that. You have to say, you can't do that, and this is what you need to do instead. You have to teach instead of just tell. You can't just tell them, you can't do that, and it just makes the young ones mad and makes them, you know, flame out. That makes them not want to come anymore because they just feel like they can't do anything. When we should be teaching them and trying to help them and explain to them, no, we don't do it this way because we need to do it this way because that's what the Bible tells us to do. We have to be clear. We have to have our conversations down. We have to be willing to help each other. And, you know, the older ones just can't despise the youth. They can't just look down on them because they're young. The Lord may have great plans for whatever it may be, and can't just look down on that person because of their age. But then that leads us to the youth. You know, the second part of that verse there is often what we don't hear. You know, we always hear in that verse 12, let no man despise thy youth, and that's it. But then we have to look at the second part of that. And it says, be thou an example to believers in the word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, and purity. It says, be an example. Now, show others how you're supposed to live. Don't let, you know, oftentimes we see the youth and, you know, we think, oh, you know, they're going to go out, they're going to do stuff they shouldn't do, but they can come back. We shouldn't do that. We should be examples to everyone that's around us. But, you know, it said that Timothy was probably about 30 when this was written. So probably for the first time in a while, some of y'all can be called youth, you know. But, you know, as the youth, we cannot give the older ones any reason to look down on us, to think that we're not capable. We have to be willing to work and study on our own to get and do the work that the Lord wants us to do. Because, as we just, we often don't pay attention to that second part of verse 12, because that means we have to work. That means we have to put effort into it. We can't just say, don't despise my youth. It says that in the Bible. You have to read the second part of that, because it shows us that we have to work. We have to be examples, and we don't want to do that. Paul tells Timothy to be an example in how to live. And we all know how we're supposed to live, but none of us want to do it because it goes against what our flesh wants. And we always go for what our flesh wants instead of what we need to do and what the Lord has mapped out for us. I mean, we have a roadmap right here of everything that we're supposed to do, but we never want to do it. We always just want to live how our flesh wants to. But, it says to be an example. Everyone in here is an example at all times. You may not think it, but you're always an example. You're either a good example or you're a bad example. So do you want people to say, yeah, that one right there, that's a good example? Or do you want to be like, okay, when say you're teaching your kids a lesson, now, don't live like this one over here. That's not a good example of how to live. We want to be that good example. But we're always an example no matter what. But when we first start reading that verse 12, it seems that Timothy was a victim of age discrimination. Just saying, don't despise your youth. That's all we hear. That's all we want to hear. Because that second part requires work. But what Paul was really telling Timothy here is that you should behave in such a way that nobody can reasonably despise your youth. Nobody can have good reason to despise your youth. And that's what Paul was telling Timothy here. And that's how, us as younger ones, how we need to live. We should live our life that the older ones and our, the youth that are around us should say, look at what they're doing, how they're living. We should help them to do more. They're living the way they need to. They're acting the way we need to. Let's give them a little more responsibility. Let's, have them teach a lesson